For decades, Frank Mallerie, an old veteran known as the Desert Ghost, has been relentlessly digging in the desolate New Mexico desert. He carries an immense, unspoken promise to find his brother in arms, Reggie Campbell. Reggie, part of the secret Lancer 7 unit, was tragically left behind in 1971 during a brutal ambush in Laos, declared unrecoverable by the military. After 50 years of tireless, solitary searching, guided by old maps and sheer will, Frank finally unearths a sun-bleached fragment of cloth and a rusted metal insignia bearing the name Campbell. But as Frank holds this long-sought proof, an F-16 fighter jet roars overhead, circling. What does this unexpected aerial presence mean for Frank's decades-long quest? If Frank's incredible story of loyalty and unwavering promise moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories of unsung heroes. Share this with someone who believes some promises are worth keeping, no matter the cost. Thank you for listening. The desert held its breath. It was far too quiet for an August afternoon. The sun pressed down relentlessly, turning the cracked earth into something fierce and untouchable. An old man worked alone in the open, stooped over a shallow pit he was digging with bare, shaking hands. Trembling, yes, but somehow steady with purpose. No tourists wandered by, no drones hummed overhead, no curious eyes behind a camera lens. Just silence, heat, and a man chasing a memory no one else could see. Locals thought he was crazy, had said so for years in hushed tones at the general store. A relic of a war long over, a ghost of a veteran stuck on some unfinished mission. But that morning, as the sun climbed and the sweat carved paths down his sun-scoured face, the old man paused. He looked down at the dust like it could hear him, feel him. "I'll find it, Reggie," he whispered. "I owe you that much. I owe you, at the very least, a damn candle in the dirt." Then the sky split. A roar like thunder rolled overhead. An F-16 fighter jet circled once, slicing the heat with its engine scream. And for the first time in decades, someone noticed. His name was Frank Mallerie, though in Sage Hollow, most folks either didn't know that or had forgotten it long ago. If they referred to him at all, it was only by whispers. The Desert Ghost, they'd say. That was how he lived on in their minds. A figure glimpsed at the edge of town, buying cans of chili and black coffee, then disappearing into the heat shimmer. Frank lived alone in a faded 1972 Winnebago sunk deep into the New Mexico high desert. It hadn't budged in years. Its tires were half buried in sun-baked sand. A weather-beaten American flag drooped from a crooked pole above the cracked windshield. It didn't wave much anymore, neither did Frank. He was 78 now. Still tall in stature, but time had rounded his shoulders, bone by bone, dragging his posture toward the earth. His skin was like dried leather, toughened by decades of sun and wind. His beard, long, wild, bone-white, seemed to grow out in defiance of grooming. And his eyes, when they caught yours, didn't shift or dart like most people's did. They stayed fixed, still. There was no fear there, no rage, just a quiet kind of weight, heavy and unyielding. Frank had once worn the Green Beret back in '69, a special forces unit buried so deep in the shadows it didn't officially exist. They called it Lancer 7. Laos was where they'd been dropped when the U.S. government insisted no such operations were happening there. Their job wasn't medals or glory, it was maps, reconnaissance, destruction. No witnesses, no traces, no acknowledgement, no return. Frank never spoke about it, not to reporters, not to therapists, not even to the few who tried to care. But if someone somehow had earned his trust, if they had the right to ask, maybe, just maybe, he'd have told them about Reggie Campbell. Reggie wasn't just another soldier. He was blood, in all the ways that counted. Alabama-born, full of mischief, and a grin that could cut through jungle fog. Carried a harmonica in his shirt pocket like it was standard-issue gear. He was 3 years younger than Frank, but sharper than half the officers they'd ever served under. Reggie had the kind of calm that didn't crack under fire. When things went loud, he got clear. Always focused, always one step ahead. But the jungle doesn't care how good you are. On their last mission together, everything went wrong. Extraction was inbound. The bird just barely made it through anti-air fire. Frank had scrambled aboard first, weapon clutched, boots slick with mud. Reggie stayed behind, covering the retreat. Frank turned in time to see him sprinting through smoke, face contorted in pain, shrapnel catching him mid-stride. Then came the voice over the radio, command cold and final. Leave him. No rescue, no recovery. Frank didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't even curse, just followed orders. That's what they trained him to do. Obey, survive. But something inside him broke that day. Splintered clean through and never healed. After the war, Frank slipped off the map, tried El Paso for a time, worked a hardware counter, lasted a few months, married once briefly. That didn't hold either. For a while there were goats, then nothing. Eventually he headed west, behind the wheel of the Winnebago, driving until the roads forgot to keep going. And that's where he stayed. Each morning before dawn, before the sun could scald the land, he'd pull on his old jungle boots, still scuffed and misshapen, take a rusted spade from its hook, and walk out into the open desert. 50 yards or so, always the same direction, never random. He'd unfold a worn leather pouch, pull out maps he'd drawn and redrawn 1,000 times over, adjusting grid lines and scribbles with a soldier's precision. Then he'd begin to dig. Some days, 2 feet, some 6. Some days the wind would bite so hard he'd have to pause, turn his back to the sting. But he never stopped, always came back the next day. No one knew what he was really searching for. Treasure, some whispered. One kid on YouTube claimed it was aliens, pointed at satellite photos and talked about energy lines. Others just shook their heads. Another shell-shocked old vet chasing shadows. But Frank knew, and so did the desert. Sometimes, just sometimes, the desert gave something back. Things that didn't belong to time anymore. Things no one else would ever understand. Spectacular, fragments of old canvas, a rusted belt hook buried in the earth. Once, even a jagged piece of metal, barely legible numbers still clinging to its worn surface. Every time he knelt down, Frank pressed his fingers into the soil like it might speak, closed his eyes, and whispered so low only the dead could hear, "I'll find you, Reggie. I swore I would." He didn't speak much when he came into town. Just bought what he needed, coffee, canned goods, new boots when the old ones fell apart, and then left without lingering. Never one for small talk, never stopping long enough for anyone to really ask questions. Some folks pitied him. Some simply steered clear, uneasy with his silence and the tired set of his eyes. But a few, mostly the older ones who knew what it meant to lose someone without getting the chance to bring them home, understood. Frank didn't want a medal. He didn't want gratitude. He sure as hell didn't want anyone's pity. All he ever wanted was to keep a promise. Just one candle pressed into the dirt, flickering against the wind. And each morning, stepping out with that same shovel in his calloused hands, he carried that promise like a flag only he could see. The rest of the world had moved on, forgotten. But Frank hadn't. Back in 1971, before the desert turned him into a ghost, Frank Mallerie had been someone else entirely. A soldier, sharp, quick, quiet, with the confidence of someone who believed in purpose. He belonged to a unit that didn't officially exist. Lancer 7, a special forces team sent on reconnaissance and sabotage runs just over the border in Laos, where the U.S. claimed it had no presence. Their missions didn't go in any record books. There were no debriefings, no press releases, no room for mistakes. They parachuted in, moved through the jungle, tracked troop movement, called in airstrikes, blew bridges, and vanished again, if they made it out at all. Everything about the operation was clean on paper. But out there it was mud, rot, shadows, and the constant itch of something watching from the trees. Lancer 7 worked in small teams, 5 or 6 men, no backup, no guarantees, just the jungle and radio silence that stretched for days. And in all that isolation, there was one constant for Frank, Reggie Campbell. Reggie was the kind of man who made hell survivable. Born in Dothan, Alabama, with that slow southern drawl and the kind of grit passed down from hard men before him. He had a quiet charm, but when the fight came, Reggie changed. He was a machine, fast, smart, lethal. He never talked himself up, never showed off. But if someone went down, he was the first there, dragging them back through fire without waiting for orders. Frank and Reggie weren't just teammates. They were brothers, the kind the world throws together through blood and chaos. They'd hunkered together in a frozen foxhole in Khe Sanh, shared half rations under mosquito nets near Bam Phanob, stitched each other up when medics weren't an option. Once, they sat back to back for 6 hours, rifles raised, a North Vietnamese patrol crouched less than 10 yards away in the dark, and neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. A look was enough, but every war has its cliff's edge. Theirs came in March '71 during a mission no one talked about afterward. Lancer 7 had been ordered into a narrow valley near Zipan to scout what was suspected to be a weapons cache. Routine, they were told. Light resistance at most, in and out. That was a lie. They dropped in under moonlight. But by midday, they were boxed in. An ambush. Tight, brutal, and prepared. NVA troops were already in position. Someone had tipped them off. Frank would never forget that moment. Not the gunshots or the explosions, but the crack of ancient trees snapping under machine gun bursts, and the radio hissing dead static while they screamed for evac. The extraction bird came low and fast, its blades chewing the jungle air, trying to hover without a clearing. They made a break for it. Frank and Reggie stayed in the rear, laying down fire to cover their team's escape. Leaves shredded, branches snapped. A man went down, then another. They dragged both to the chopper, lungs on fire, bodies running on raw adrenaline. Frank climbed in first, one hand gripping the skid, chest heaving, his rifle banging against his ribs. He reached back, arms stretched out. Reggie was just a few yards away. Then came the blast. A streak of fire and steel. Shoulder fired. The tail of the helicopter shuddered violently as the rocket hit. And Reggie, rancher and truth or consequences and paid in cash, using up nearly every cent he had. The thing was rusted, sun-bleached, and hadn't run in years. But Frank didn't care. He spent the next 3 weeks fixing it up, sweating through his shirt beneath the desert sun, turning a dead machine into something that could carry him back to the place that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He slept inside it at night, lying awake on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, letting the past crawl back in. By the time the engine turned over and held a steady idle, Frank had made up his mind. He wasn't coming back until he found what he was looking for, or until the desert took him to. He drove out at dawn, steering the Winnebago through cracked roads and faded towns. The radio didn't work, and he liked it that way. He didn't need music, didn't want distraction. All he had was that promise, the echo of Reggie's name still lodged like a splinter behind his ribs. He didn't know what he expected to find out there. Not exactly. Bones, maybe. Wreckage. Some forgotten remnant swallowed by sand and time. Or maybe deep down he still hoped for a miracle, that Reggie had somehow survived, had carved out a life in the shadow of secrecy, waiting for the day someone would come back for him. But hope wasn't what fueled him. It was duty. It was the unbearable weight of owing a man your life and never paying it back. The road narrowed the deeper he went. What was once paved turned to gravel, then to dirt. Power lines vanished. Cell signal died. And all that remained was land and sky, and a silence so complete it rang in his ears. He reached the basin by noon. There were no signs, no fences, just an expanse of scorched earth that looked as though it had been forgotten by God. He parked on the ridge, grabbed the worn leather journal where he'd marked every theory, every scrap of memory, and started walking. Each step felt like stepping back in time, into the sweat and gunpowder, the shouted orders and choked cries. The jungle wasn't here, but in his mind, it rose up around him all the same. He could still hear the scream of the rotors, smell the burning fuel, feel the drop in his gut when the chopper tilted and Command's voice crackled with finality. "We're pulling out. Mission terminated." Frank moved slowly, scanning the land with a soldier's eye. Nothing about this terrain made sense to the civilians, but Frank wasn't here for them. He followed the slope of the hills, the curves etched into his memory like scars. He tracked the elevation, the wind direction, the cover lines he remembered from those frantic minutes of chaos. The deeper he went, the louder Reggie's voice seemed to echo in the back of his mind. By the time the sun began to sink behind the rocks, he found it. a place where the earth sloped just wrong, where vegetation never grew back. A scorch mark, long since faded, but still there. He dropped to his knees, fingers tracing the cracked soil. Something was here, he could feel it. Frank didn't speak. He didn't pray. He just sat there in the gathering dark, head bowed, as if Reggie might rise up from the dirt if he waited long enough. But the desert gave nothing. That night, he built a fire and sat beside it, Reggie's name written over and over again in the margins of the journal resting on his lap. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew he wouldn't leave. Not this time. Not until he found the truth, no matter how long it took. Because some promises don't get buried. Not under orders, not under time, not even under silence. And Frank Mallerie was a man who kept his word, even if it killed him. He'd found a mechanic near Los Cruces who knew enough not to ask questions. Frank stocked up the Winnebago with gas cans, cases of canned food, a box of old army tools, and then, without saying goodbye to anyone, he turned the key, pointed the nose of the RV south, and drove. The blacktop road faded into gravel, gravel dissolved into sand, and still he kept going. When the Winnebago couldn't go any farther, he stopped, stepped out into the scorched vastness, and began to dig. He had no blueprint, no map, no grand strategy, just a promise and the ache of memory. Each morning, Frank slung a hand compass around his neck, grabbed his shovel, and walked 50, sometimes 60 yards away from his old RV. The desert was endless, wide as breath, empty as silence, red earth broken only by wind and heat. To most, it would have looked like nothingness, a place stripped of meaning. But to Frank, it was full of unspoken promise. He imagined the ground below carved into invisible squares, a grid only he could see. He'd work one section until the dirt hardened or the wind rose too harsh, then shift 10 feet and start over. Markers moved, shovel sank. No one ordered him to be there. No one came to help. And Frank didn't need either. He didn't even need hope. What he had was a vow. To the few who saw him on the outer rim of town, he was a strange figure in the distance, silent, lean, moving dirt under the sun. Some guessed he was ex-military. Others were sure the desert had cooked his brain. A handful liked to believe he was chasing buried treasure, chasing some ancient myth with nothing but a shovel and the belief that maybe, just maybe, something was out there. But no one ever walked up to him and asked. Not really. And Frank never gave them a reason to. Because for him, every time his shovel pierced that stubborn soil, he could hear Reggie's voice, clear as the desert sky. "You better not give up on me, brother." Frank would answer, quietly, to no one at all, "I'm still here." Through summers that burned the soles of his boots and winters that gnawed at his bones, he stayed. When the Winnebago leaked, he patched it himself. When the radiator cracked, twice, he fixed it with scrap metal and prayers. One brutal summer, he dropped 20 pounds and nearly passed out from heat stroke. Another year, a coyote chewed through his supply box and scattered cans across the sand. He chased it off, swinging a rusted crowbar, cursing with a voice out of use. Then, standing in the wreckage, he laughed, for the first time in months. That rusty, broken sound reminded him he was still human. Yes, he was alone, but not abandoned, because beneath all that silence and sand was someone he had sworn never to leave behind. While most people spent their final years trying to slow down, Frank Mallerie spent his digging deeper, into the earth, into a memory, into a promise he wouldn't let die. He imagined the day, someday, when a hand would brush dirt from a face and a voice would say, "There you are," and Frank would be ready. 30 miles north, in a town called Sage Hollow, where the population hovered just over 600 if you counted the dab, folks had grown used to the old man who drifted in once a month. He never spoke much, just came in, bought his supplies, and left. No one knew his name. No one asked. They had no idea that just down the highway, out beyond the dunes, Frank was digging not for gold, not for riches, but for something far heavier, far holier. But what they did know was that he was strange, and small towns are made for whispers. Some said he was a soldier who'd snapped after the war. Others thought he was one of those survivalist types, digging bunkers and waiting for the end of the world. Teenagers were the cruelest. One group followed him once, phones out, filming his every motion. They posted the video with a caption, "Desert Grandpa digs for aliens." It spread just far enough to make its way through the internet. Strangers laughed, mocked. But no one in the comments knew what that silence cost him. No one noticed how he never looked up once, never acknowledged the camera. He just kept digging, or she, one heavy scoop at a time. There were rumors of Spanish gold buried out there. Old tales about lost missions and forgotten maps, secret tunnels and sacred grounds. Those stories gave the locals something to talk about between coffee refills at the diner. But none of them ever asked why he really did it. None of them really wanted to know. Because the truth was simple. Every hole Frank dug was a prayer. Every drop of sweat was a wordless hymn, a tribute to a man he couldn't leave behind. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He wasn't chasing legends. He was trying to bring one home. Still, not everyone looked the other way. Some folks chose to see something deeper, even if they didn't have the words for it. Nancy, who ran the general store, always tucked an extra bottle of water in his bag. Never mentioned it, never charged. Harold, the retired mechanic, would sometimes leave a box of canned chili by the wire fence near Frank's usual stop. Said nothing. Just left it there, as if it had always been part of the landscape. It wasn't charity, it was something quieter, something closer to respect. They didn't understand him, but they honored him, each in their own silent way. The desert had always kept its secrets, buried deep beneath layers of silence and sand. But in the town of Sage Hollow, where trust had long worn thin and even old stories frayed with doubt, there were still a few souls who understood the quiet shape of duty, people who could recognize honor, even when it came wrapped in silence and bearing a shovel, 50 years too late. Just after dawn, when the desert wind dropped to nothing and stillness pressed against the world like a held breath, Frank Mallerie stepped outside, the kind of quiet that rang in his ears like memory. The sky was painted in soft, early light, the only gentle mercy the desert offered before the midday blaze would strip everything raw. It wasn't hot yet, but the dryness clung to his skin. His boots pressed into the hard-packed ground with practiced weight. The shovel swung at his side, worn smooth from years of use. A compass bounced lightly against his chest. He moved slower now. The joints in his knees groaned with age. The bones in his hands stiffened from long days under the unforgiving sun. The air sliced sharper than it once did, but that fire, the one that kept him searching, kept him digging, burned as steady as it ever had. 10 feet east of last week's grid, he chose a new patch of desert. There the earth shifted differently, looser, not disturbed recently, but in the way only decades of pressure and heat could disguise an old wound. He recognized it. He always did. Frank had learned to read the signs, the whisper in the sand, the story in the way dirt packed over history's scars. Shovel to soil, he worked with quiet precision. Layer by layer, he peeled back time. Every handful of dust sifted through fingers that had grown careful from years of reverence. And then came the sound. Not the sharp clank of metal against stone, nor the thud of something buried deep. Just a faint, brittle crunch. Different. He dropped to his knees. With bare fingers, he brushed the dirt aside, slow as if uncovering something sacred. His hands moved like they remembered. The earth fell away beneath his touch, revealing a fragment of faded cloth, sun-bleached, nearly white, but unmistakably military. Beneath it, partially lodged in rust-stained soil, a metal insignia glinted faintly in the light. It was bent, the edges warped from heat long ago, but the core of it was still intact. A name barely legible beneath the crusted rust. Campbell. Frank froze. His breath caught, chest locked tight as if the desert itself had pressed a hand against his lungs. Around him, the dry world blurred. It folded inward, shrinking away from the present, slipping backward into a jungle haze 50 years and half a world away. To the smoke, the shouting, the moment Reggie Campbell had vanished. Gone without a trace. Frank's hands gripped the tag like it might disappear. His lips trembled. And there, in the middle of nowhere, beneath the rising sun, Frank Mallerie, who had outlived the war, the silence, and everyone who'd stopped searching, broke down. He didn't sob, didn't cry out, just sat in the dirt with his shovel beside him, his shoulders shaking, quiet tears carving clean paths through the dust on his face. "I told you I'd find you," he whispered, his voice rasping raw. "I never stopped." What Frank didn't know, what no one in Sage Hollow could have imagined, was that for nearly half a year, his tireless routine had been quietly observed. A low-level Pentagon surveillance program had flagged his digging as an anomaly, unusual heat and motion patterns recorded across abandoned military training zones. Data like that didn't usually mean much. Probably just an old vet with too much time, they'd assumed. No one followed up until that morning. One junior analyst at White Sands noticed something different. A sudden stillness in grid 27B, a thermal pause, followed by a brief, erratic burst of movement, spike patterns that usually happen when someone stumbled across something they weren't prepared to find. A quiet call was made, internal, off the books. 20 minutes later, the sky above Frank began to rumble. He looked up, instinct pulling him upright. His spine straightened, body falling into an old posture, as if his uniform were still on. The rising sun flared against his eyes as a gray streak crossed the horizon and banked hard into a wide arc. Not a training pass, not some random patrol. It circled, low, deliberate, watching him. Frank didn't move, just stood there in the heat and wind, shielding his face, squinting at the F-16 as it glided overhead. It wasn't in a rush, didn't roar past like the others. It circled him once, then again, marking the spot. Inside the cockpit, the pilot had been given bare-bones orders. Confirm human activity. Visual report only. Do not engage. But when he saw the man below, solitary, weathered, still as a statue, clutching something against his chest, he hesitated. Didn't radio anything, just kept circling. Back in D.C., satellite images were coming in fast. The team reviewing them stared in disbelief. There it was, what had long been considered lost, scrubbed from military records, buried beneath classified denials. A downed aircraft from 1971, lost during a blackout operation, had resurfaced. They couldn't afford delay. Quietly, swiftly, the chain of command moved. A forensic recovery team was dispatched. Under the guise of a routine Air Force survey, no media, no headlines, just classified orders, he was told to go. Retrieve what had been found. Find answers. Out there in the arid expanse, Frank stood still beneath the dimming sky, his gaze unwavering, and he tucked the worn tag back into his shirt pocket, exhaled slowly, and let the silence settle over him again. He didn't know if anyone was actually coming, didn't know if the military would bury the truth again, like they did Reggie. But deep in his gut, he felt something shift. It was faint, but real, like a hairline crack forming in a long, untouched wall. The silence wasn't whole anymore. And somewhere, deep in the quiet corridors of the very institution that had once turned its back on them, someone was finally listening. The morning after a jet circled overhead, the desert was anything but silent. It began as a low tremor in the ground, deep and steady, impossible to mistake. Frank had heard that exact sound before, decades ago, in a jungle on the far side of the world. But this wasn't some memory haunting him. This was now. From the eastern horizon, a Black Hawk helicopter emerged, gliding slow over the ridgeline. Its rotors whipped sand into choking clouds as it descended into the scrubby clearing near Frank's RV. It stirred up more than dust. It pulled 50 years of silence up into the air, tearing open the decades that had weighed down on this place. Still, Frank didn't budge. He stood at rigid attention, as if it were 1971 again. Boots firmly planted, spine straight, dog tags resting against his chest, just like they always had. When the helicopter settled onto the earth and its doors swung open, a group of soldiers stepped out. Not in fatigues, in full-dress uniforms. Among them was a man nearing his late 50s, his chest glittering with rows of ribbons. The insignia on his collar marked him as a lieutenant general. He walked with the weight of command, and when his boots touched the sand, they landed like thunderclaps. He stopped in front of Frank. No words, no pomp, just a single silent salute. It hung in the air between them, respectful and still. Frank hesitated, only for a breath, before returning it, sharp and sure. Then, at last, the general spoke. "Sergeant First Class Frank Mallerie," he said, his voice even, resolute. On behalf of the United States Army and the nation you served with honor, we thank you, and we're sorry it took this long. Frank didn't respond. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned his head toward the disturbed patch of earth just a few steps away. He pointed. "He's here," Frank said simply. "Dig careful." The recovery team began their work, steady, deliberate, silent. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, soft brushes, metal detectors. Every movement was slow and precise, as if they were unearthing something sacred. Frank watched from a few paces back, arms folded tightly, sweat trickling down the creases of his sun-worn face. He didn't look away, not once. As the sun climbed toward noon, a young corporal stood up from the dust. In both hands, he held something like it was a holy relic, faded, bent, but still legible. Dog tags. Campbell R., U.S. Army. Opio. A few minutes later, they recovered bone fragments, the worn sole of a combat boot, and tucked inside a rusted ammo pouch. A harmonica, weathered but whole, untouched, unplayed. That was enough. Frank turned away. He didn't need to see the rest. He'd already known. He'd always known. By nightfall, the quiet desert moment had already become something else entirely. A local reporter from El Paso caught wind of the military activity and picked up the scent of a story. A photo was snapped, Frank standing beside the general, and it lit a spark. Local news first, then national, CBS, CNN, Fox. The headlines came fast, all with the same message. Vietnam veteran finds missing brother-in-arms after 50 years of searching alone. They called it a miracle, a testament to loyalty, to honor, to the kind of devotion that doesn't fade with time. Senators called, retired generals, journalists, people Frank hadn't spoken to in decades reached out. Invitations came from Capitol Hill. The Pentagon, they wanted ceremonies, medals, speeches. Frank didn't want any of it. He asked for just one thing. Looking the general dead in the eye, he said, "Let him go home." That was it. 1 week later, Reggie Campbell was flown home to Dothan, Alabama. His remains were laid to rest with full military honors. There was a 21-gun salute, a folded flag, the whole ceremonial rite. His family, long gone, had left only distant cousins behind. But the whole town came, every last one of them. Veterans from every branch of the service lined the road to the cemetery, all in dress uniform. Some raised their hands in salute. Others wept openly. At the front of it all stood Frank. No dress uniform, no medals, just the same boots and the same olive drab shirt he'd worn every day for a decade. It was clean, buttoned, and over his heart, he wore Reggie's tag. When the final note of taps rang out through the trees and into the fading light, Frank didn't move, didn't speak. But everything in him said what needed saying. Reggie was finally home. He whispered it so softly it was barely more than breath. "You're home now, brother." Far away in New Mexico, the RV still sat beneath the relentless desert sun, motionless and quiet once more. Frank lingered there for a few more days before finally packing up. For the first time in over 40 years, his map was folded and tucked away. His old shovel lay still. He hadn't set out to be noticed. He hadn't been chasing glory or recognition. He had gone out with one purpose, to keep a promise. And now that promise had been kept. They offered him medals. They wanted statues. There were requests for interviews, television appearances, public recognition. He declined every single one, because Frank Mallerie didn't care if the world knew what he'd done. He only wanted one name to be remembered. And now, finally, it was. That morning, the skies above Arlington National Cemetery were wide and still, washed in a quiet, vivid blue that made everything below feel even more solemn. The rows of white headstones stretched endlessly toward the horizon, each one a final resting place for someone who once wore the uniform, each one a silent witness to a life given in service. But on this day, all attention was focused on a single casket, draped in the American flag, resting beneath the shade of a great oak tree. Reggie Campbell had come home at last. The honor guard moved with flawless precision. Every step measured, every breath paced to the second. The folded flag, tight and triangular, lay cradled in the arms of a young Marine who held it as if it weighed far more than cloth and thread. The crowd stood still as the minister spoke, his words solemn and clear, about duty, loyalty, and the kind of sacrifice that had waited half a century to be seen, to be honored. At the very front, standing a few feet apart from the generals, the high-ranking officers, and the cluster of cameras, stood Frank Mallerie. He wore the same olive green dress uniform he'd been issued back in 1971. The color had faded, the fabric had worn thin around the elbows, but it still fit. It was freshly pressed, buttoned to the top. There were no medals on his chest, just with one small object pinned neatly over his heart: Reggie's dog tag. In his hands, he held the folded American flag he had been given just moments earlier. He held it gently, reverently, like it was made of fragile glass. His knuckles had turned white from the pressure of his grip. As the minister's final words faded into silence, every head in the crowd tilted upward. In the distance, a low hum began to grow louder, then louder still, until 4 F-16s burst into view, flying in tight formation across the wide Virginia sky. Just as they passed over the cemetery, one jet broke away from the group, banking left and climbing sharply alone into the sky. The missing man formation, a final salute, the highest aerial tribute the military offers. One space left open in the sky to honor the warrior who no longer fills it. Frank didn't look up. He didn't need to. Instead, he bowed his head slightly and murmured just loud enough for himself and maybe the man he stood for to hear. "Took me half a lifetime, buddy, but I kept my word." He closed his eyes. There was no applause, no headlines. He didn't want them. All he had ever asked for was this moment. One grave, one name returned, one promise fulfilled. The crowd began to drift away in silence, but Frank remained. He stood rooted at the foot of Reggie's headstone, unmoving. He didn't cry. He didn't say another word. He simply stood there like a soldier still on duty until the breeze picked up again and the last F-16 vanished beyond the edge of the sky. Not every story makes the front page. Some unfold slowly, quietly, over the span of decades, in sunburnt deserts where a single man, armed only with a shovel and stubborn devotion, held on to a vow the world had long forgotten. Frank Mallerie never sought fame. He didn't fight for decoration. He fought for memory, for loyalty, for a friend, for something that feels all too rare these days: honor. In a world that moves too fast, where today's headlines are tomorrow's landfill, where loyalty often feels like a relic of the past, Frank's story reminds us that some debts are not paid in noise, but in silence, one steady step at a time. Maybe we all have someone like Reggie, a name tucked deep in our hearts, someone we once stood beside, someone we still owe, not on a battlefield, but through an apology left unsaid, a call never made, a promise we barely remember making. So ask yourself, who would you dig for day after day for 50 years? Have you ever kept a quiet promise long after others told you it wasn't worth it? Do you still believe we live in a place where honor matters? We'd love to hear your story, especially from our veterans, their families, and those who carry memories like medals. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that some heroes never wear capes, just boots and silence, then share it with someone who still believes promises should be kept. From all of us, thank you for listening. And to Frank, wherever you are, rest easy, soldier.